one of the things I'm going to do in this talk is sort of maybe make a little bit of trouble for the classical liberal rejection of social justice. Right? So I think that there's space within the tradition that you can carve out where social justice is kind of important. Now, there's another thing between this contrast between classical liberals and modern liberals. Modern liberal theorists typically reject concerns about the so-called economic liberties, like having a basic right to own things and trade things that they own. It's not that they don't care about it, they just don't think it's as important or as basic as other liberal rights, like speech or some other more like social liberal rights. So they don't care so much about, they reject a commitment to like free markets, and the classical liberals will typically count this rejection as a major deficiency in their view, in the modern liberal view. Right? Some classical liberals, especially some libertarians, make a commitment to free markets paramount, such that property rights trump most concerns about the least well-off in a society. So I guess a kind of a subsidiary aim of this talk is to get clear about the proper place of the economic liberties in liberal theory. So first, social justice, what is it? Typically amongst proponents of social justice is a kind of distributive justice. It's a concern about equality or economic distributions hitting some pattern or other. The pattern could be something like equal shares for all, something like that. Within the classical liberal tradition, folks have identified three basic problems with this idea of social justice. And this is the argument for the classical liberal rejection of concern for notions of social justice. So Hayek writes about this in his book called The Mirage of Social Justice. And Nozick writes about it in his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Nozick called this pattern that someone might want to hit a kind of end state principle of distributive justice. So the idea is about hitting this end state, whether it's equal shares for all or something closely aligned with that. So they treat justice as a kind of function of outcomes rather than procedures. It's about hitting this end state. So here's the first problem. The first problem is this claim that liberty upsets any pattern that you might want to set out for your society to hit. It will upset any kind of end state that you're aiming at. So here's the argument, right? Assume your favorite pattern principle of justice, whatever it is. Let's say it's equal shares for all. What happens next? From that, quote, perfectly just starting point, society is definitely going to deviate from it. It's going to deviate from it, furthermore, by a series of voluntary transactions. Transactions which themselves involve no injustice. So Nozick's famous example of this involves a basketball player at the time. Nozick's writing in the 70s. His name was Wilt Chamberlain. I don't know if you've heard of him. And you'll have to update the numbers in the example for like current NBA salaries. But here's a quote from Nozick. Wilt Chamberlain is greatly in demand by basketball teams, being a great gate attraction. So also suppose, he says, that contracts only run for a year with players being free agents. So Chamberlain signs the following sort of contract with a team. In each home game, 25 cents from the price of each ticket of admission goes to him. And he says, we ignore the question of whether or not he's gouging the owners. Let them look out for themselves, he says. Let's suppose that in one season, 1 million persons attend his home games. And Wilt Chamberlain ends up with $250,000. Okay, in the 70s, that's a lot of money. A much larger sum than the average income of people who are paying for the ticket, certainly, and larger than anyone else has. Is he entitled to his income? Is this new distribution unjust? Right? So we started out perfectly just. We started out that way by assumption. And now we just observe people making free and voluntary transactions. What do we do now? What do we do now? What would be the right thing to do? More specifically, where did things go wrong? Which of the transactions in the story would you like to forbid? Who ought to determine the uses to which people can put their resources? Who would that make better off if you were to invalidate those transactions, to stop people from making them? Would it make anybody better off to stop people from making those voluntary transactions, which led Wilt Chamberlain to make so much more money than anybody else? He's counting on you to say, no, it wouldn't make anybody better off. So should we do that? What would the effects of that be if we were to? That leads to the second argument. The interventions that would prevent people from making these voluntary transactions would actually make society poorer, right? So the first argument says, like, Nozick has set up this example deliberately to be as unobjectionable an historical set of transactions as possible, right? The resources that Chamberlain uses are his own labor, his own talents, and he provides a reasonable service. It's a service that is, by any reasonable standard, a kind of luxury good. People don't have to go to NBA games. Right? So every decision to transfer their initial holdings effectively to Chamberlain, what's your objection to that? And the second problem is, if you were to do that, if you were to interfere with those transactions, you wouldn't be making anybody better. You'd actually be making people worse off. So interventions that would be necessary to maintain a specific pattern of distribution in a society, the constant interventions to stop transactions from being made, to correct the distributional effects of these transactions after they're made, that would mess with the price system. Hayek makes a distinction in his writing between law and legislation. Law is the good one. Here he's talking about where there's no end state in mind. There's no target to hit. It's a purely procedural affair that just allows people within these general abstract rules to do whatever they want, to make their own decisions. Think of what he thinks of as legislation as something like bureaucratic tinkering. So these would be rules that, like, somebody notices that, oh no, the set of voluntary transactions have made things go wrong. What do we do in order to finagle things so that we can maintain our end state principle of justice? What can we do? And so there's a sort of a central plan to bring about a particular outcome. And in order to make sure you hit that plan, you have to do things that will identify roles that people will play, what they'll have to achieve in those roles. In contrast, Hayek has in mind something like a spontaneous ordering. Right? Government, what it does is provide these stable, general rules, a stable framework of rules, a stable and known framework where you can actually make plans in the context of them to achieve your own ends, not ends that are decided upon for you. A government under a rule of law, rather than under a law as bureaucratic tinkering, government under a rule of law is like a referee and a provider of a rule book. And it just, as much as possible, lets the players play. So what we should want from a system of justice for Hayek is the same thing that we would want from like a system of traffic management. It's just a framework that helps us form mutual expectations about who has the right of way in a particular context. An effective system of traffic management allows us to coordinate on a set of mutual expectations that each of us finds useful in staying out of each other's way as much as possible to secure our individually chosen projects. But a system of traffic management doesn't pick our destinations for us. The problem is there's no general rules, the following of which would guarantee that the distribution of wealth would come out in a way that hit our preferred end state. So there would have to be constant bureaucratic tinkering in ways that manipulates the economy and the resources in it to make sure we maintain the end state, the pattern of distribution that we like best. So you have to pick. You're either going to go for law or legislation, and if you pick law, this general abstract framework, then you're not going to know what you get. It would be like a box of chocolates, I hear. Right? Never know what voluntary agents are going to go for when they interact with each other. Here's problem 3, and Hayek's most famous for making this argument. He says that the very notion of social justice is incoherent. So here's a short 3-step argument for why he thinks this. A distribution of holdings is only unjust if it results from the unjust and deliberate actions of individuals. He's not counting on anybody objecting to that. He thinks it's sort of definitional. Justice and injustice can only be attributes of the deliberate actions of human beings. Right? Actions, maybe even inactions, are unjust, but not states of affairs. That's premise 1. Do you want to see premise 2? But there's no central distributor that's responsible for the distribution of holdings in a free society. Distributive outcomes are the joint effects of the actions of many, many people, never foreseen, never intended by anyone. Literally, the interactions of billions of people in the world. These countless transactions that many, many individuals make. That's what produces an end state. That's what makes the difference to the distributions of holdings, right? There's no central distributor making it the case that the current distribution of holdings in our society are what they are. But if that's right, who are you saying did something unjust when you say that the current holdings, the current distribution of holdings are unjust? Again, there's a proviso always that says that these transactions are free and voluntary. So long as that's true, I'm not sure where you want to poke a hole. One seems true, two seems true, but if 1 and 2 are true, 3 has to be true. Now, let me be a little clearer about this, right? It's not even that market outcomes are just, right? They're just outcomes. They're not the kind of thing that can be just or unjust on Hayek's argument. Where no one distributes, there might be something lamentable about the result. There might be things that you don't like about the result. But the result won't be an injustice in the way that engineering such a result would be. Yeah, if you have a central distributor who's responsible for the fact that some people are very, very poor and others are very, very rich, I think the very, very poor would have a legitimate complaint against that distributor. But who's the distributor? There is no distributor. So there's no particular person or group who can plausibly be held responsible for large-scale patterns that emerge out of the millions of individual economic transactions that happen every day. So maybe this is the main idea. This is a kind of slogan, I guess. No distributive justice where no one distributes. This is why Hayek says distributive justice is a mirage. And so considerations of justice provide no justification for correcting the results of the market. There might be things that you can do to improve certain people's situations, but you would be improving their situations. You wouldn't be correcting for an injustice. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I can try again. So here's another version of the argument. The distribution of holdings in a society arises from the aggregation of all our ordinary decisions about what talents to develop, where to live, what to purchase, so on, our different valuings and how we go about our business. Except for certain special cases specifically identified as unjust by some theory of justice and transfer, like you can't steal stuff, you can't lie to people to get their stuff. Right? These ordinary decisions aren't unjust. They're just, again, free and voluntary transactions. And I found a typo. Therefore, the distribution that arises from them are not unjust. Yeah. So here we have like this result, right? You could say that a distribution is unjust if it arises from the conscious and deliberate distribution from a central distributor. We don't have one of those. You could identify injustice in specific transactions, like if I stole somebody's pen. But setting those aside, I mean, that doesn't, those kinds of transactions, those involuntary transactions, aren't what really explains why people have what they have. So, generally, there's not much you can say against the pattern of distribution that we have, except maybe that you don't like it. So maybe this is the main idea. Inequalities that are the product of spontaneous orders are different, morally speaking, from inequalities that are produced deliberately, either by a central distributor or by a thief or whatever. I mean, here's another example to drive this home, right? If you let's say you wanted to have like a marriage partner, you wanted to be married, like really badly, but for whatever reason, nobody wants to marry you. Right? You can't find anybody who wants to marry you. You would be disappointed, but social justice violation? No, not a violation of social justice. However, imagine that we lived in a different society. And in this society, mates were assigned by a central distributor of mates, like the marriage czar would assign everybody who wants a mate with a mate. And you say, I'd like to have a mate. I'm really interested in having a marriage partner. And that central distributor said to you, and you specifically, no, you don't get one. Social injustice. That sounds more plausibly like a social injustice than the first part of that example. Right? So when marriage is something like a spontaneous order, you might not like the result, but it's not a social injustice. If marriage partners are assigned not by a spontaneous order, but by a central distributor, and you don't get one and you want one, I think you'd have a legitimate complaint. So let me try to put this all together into one sort of master argument. This is the Hayek-Nozick challenge to social justice. Any unjust distribution would have to be the result of either the unjust distribution of a central distributor or unjust actions of dispersed individuals, like taking people's stuff and so on. But there isn't a central distributor, and the countless ordinary transactions of countless individuals typically aren't unjust either. And so you can complain all you want, but put your complaint in a different form. Not as a social injustice, not as something to correct, but maybe as something that you don't like, and maybe you would like to improve it. I have a small objection to this very sort of ordinary and traditional classical liberal argument against social justice. Right? Again, overwhelmingly the tradition says this. I just have a small quibble. It goes like this. A distribution isn't merely a product of the decentralized decisions of private individuals. Turns out it's not. They neglected another alternative, another option, another possibility. It's this. A distribution is also partly a function of the legal and social rules under which those individuals operate. Remember the general abstract rules that sort of tell us what we can do and what we can't do within these broad constraints within which we can direct our own efforts and our own affairs. But you can't tell me that if I set up a society like this, where it has these three laws, and I compared it to another society that had different laws, you can't tell me that the distributional effects would be the same. Probably wouldn't be the same. So, now the question is, what should they be? And I think this is an intelligible question. This isn't incoherent, right? This is something we'd want to know. What should the rules look like, these general abstract rules that within which we can pursue our own ends? What should they look like in order for the society to be just? And I think not only is this not incoherent, Hayek knows it's not incoherent because he actually does a bit of this in his written work. Tries to think about what law should look like and what it shouldn't in order for people not to have a legitimate complaint against that society. So now here's the part where we do a little review, because these general abstract rules, among them are property rules. We said that property rules are important because they settle conflicts over who gets to use a resource or a good. Fundamentally, we said property rights are rights to say no, the right to exclude others. It says that when you're the owner of something, you have the right to exercise decision-making power with respect to the resource. So they're claim rights, rights to exclude others from using them. How do we get these claim rights? Where do they come from? Imagine a world in which nothing's owned. So everyone's at liberty to use whatever he likes. The whole world is a commons. Here's what Locke pointed out. The first person to claim a property right, like in some plot of land or something like that, or an object, this person's basically saying the following. Hey, everybody, you know how yesterday you could come over here, walk across this field, pick an apple off this tree? Well, not anymore. I now regard this field and this tree and these apples on it as mine. Except in very special circumstances, maybe there are easements or something like that. You can't cross it without my permission. And you can't eat my apples unless I say so. What's more, I regard myself as having the right to, even if it's necessary, using violence to stop you from taking my stuff now. If you cross into this plot of land, I'll hit you with a stick or something. I'll hit you. So Locke says about a case like that, what could possibly justify a person using coercion against another person to stop them from using something? How do you get to be able to claim that kind of right, to assert that kind of right? Again, in the first instance, when you claim a property right, you're reducing the available actions that another person could take. You're interfering with those people who want to use that stuff. What justifies your doing so? So what's the justification? Why do you get to say, can't cross here, can't take my apples? What have I done? I have ownership. What justifies my ownership claim? What did I do? What justifies me asserting these rights is that I've mixed my labor with it. So you say to me when I make these claims, well, why can't I? What gives you the right to stop me from coming over and doing these things that I could do just yesterday? And Locke says, Locke's answer is, I've mixed my labor with it. Now, is that enough? was that enough for Locke? Part of the justificatory story, it wasn't just that you mix your labor with it, but something else had to be true. Yeah, he had this proviso that says you're only justified in making these claims, asserting these rights, if you do so in a context that leaves enough and is good for others. I think the idea here, and I made this argument on Monday, the idea here is that as a whole, a private property regime had better be to everyone's benefit. And we made the case on Monday that it generally is. Like, what would our society look like if nobody was able to assert property claims? It would be a wasteland, right? Could our country support 1/3 of a billion people if nobody had property claims? No. You wouldn't even exist, probably. Right? Or if you did exist, you'd probably exist for a short time and then die of malnutrition, like most of our ancestors did. A private property regime has been a boon to the whole human population. But it's still true that property rights are coercive barriers. Question arises, is the coercion justified? General answer is, yeah, right? So what we've done here is we've applied liberalism's liberty principle and liberalism's legitimacy principle in order to show that these claims are generally legitimate. What the argument suggests is that in order for it to be permissible for us to reasonably expect that others respect the property rights regime, be justified in using violence to make them observe the rules that make it up, it has to be true that this regime works out so that they give everyone a sufficient stake in them. Now at this point, you're very often going to hear an objection. If I'm not wrong, I think the objection comes from Rousseau. People who are privileged relative to others, they invented the state. Why did they invent the state? To protect their property claims in the name of justice and equality for all. But these haves determine where property rights begin and end. They've cooked the rules in their favor. They pick rules that perpetuate their advantage at the expense of others. Property rights regime is not justified. I think I've shown what I think is the right way to respond to this objection. You say, no, people really are better off than they would be without it. A property rights regime isn't a negative-sum game like this. It's not a zero-sum game like this. It's a positive-sum game, and for the most part, and even more, it prevents our society from turning into a negative-sum game. It makes sure that resources are preserved rather than destroyed. So I think that's the right response. But I mean, you have to evaluate the empirical arguments on these two sides to get the right answer. You'd have to do the work of showing that these rules are justified because everyone really does have a sufficient stake in the rules that we have that protect property rights. So, but now the only question becomes, what should they look like? So I have 3 questions. How far-reaching should they be? Remember, I drew the axis, right? There was something like, how much control? Should it be like absolute control over the thing? And over what things? Do they include like large expanses of ocean, the atmosphere, ideas, right? So when we try to evaluate, right, are property rules justified? The answer is yes. Which property rules are justified? The ones that are sort of out here, the ones that are sort of here or here-ish. How far-reaching should they be? How strong should they be? So do they work out reasonably to everyone's favor? So here's a question that came up. Should we think of property rights as things absolute, in the sense that if it came down to it, I would have to respect someone's property claim even if it meant dying in the streets, even if it meant, in the example of the being caught in the blizzard and I could break into the cabin to get warm and not die. Should I say, no, I should not break into the cabin? It's not mine after all. There's a lock on it. The owner doesn't want me in it. Guess I will have to freeze to death. So one question is, are the relevant property rights that can be legitimately defended that strong? I'm not going to tell you what I think. But I want you to think about an answer. But it gives us a position to sort of think in a different way about social justice, I think. So one way of thinking about social justice is, well, we want to make sure that no one ever suffers from bad luck. We want to make sure that distribution of holdings in society is relatively equal. We want to hit a sort of patterned end state where something is true about everybody, whatever it is, maybe that they have equal shares or something. That's one way of thinking about social justice that's mainly associated with these modern welfare liberals. But there's another way of thinking about it. We want to make sure that it's legitimate when we demand that other people comply with the rules that protect property rights. And I actually have a question for you. If social justice is really about this rather than this, if it's about this, then what do we need? What do the rules have to look like? What should they look like in order for it to be true that our demand that other people respect property claims are legitimate? So sometimes when I ask a question, it's like a rhetorical question. I don't really expect an answer. This isn't one of those questions. This is one of those questions where, I'm actually curious to know what you think. What do we need are the rules and institutions of our society? What kind of policies? What should we do in order to make sure that this is true? I don't know if we want a microphone. He's done the thing where he's signaled in the conventional way that he'd like to talk. So let's have a microphone for him.
I would think that we need rules or guidelines that we all agree with. So it'd have to be something that the society agrees on, because how can we be held accountable to something that we didn't commit to or agree?
So what counts as agreement in the context, like maybe just voting on a policy? Is that what you mean?
Sure.
Does that if we vote on a policy and the policy wins, then you want to count that as we've agreed about it? Maybe that's right.
Maybe.
Okay. There's someone behind you. You could pass the mic to.
On Monday, in your talk about property rights, you never made the case for a natural right to property. You basically made the right that we agree that it's in the best interest of everyone, and therefore that's why we acknowledge the right to property. You could therefore then make the case for social justice, that we can then agree it's in everyone's best interest, that we believe in a sense of fairness and social justice. Therefore, you have a competing right to justice versus property, and you then have to make the case of why property would be separate.
So I just want to take issue with the first thing you said. The labor argument that Locke offers is a sort of natural rights argument in favor of justifying property rights. It's just not the whole story. And even the second part of the story, the proviso that he suggests, he actually thinks that that's part of the natural law too. Because he says, look, given that these resources have been given to us by God in common for our mutual benefit, for if I make a claim that actually works against your interests, then that's not legitimate. It has to be true. In other words, that I leave is enough and is good for the others who come along. So that actually counts, at least in Locke's thinking, as sort of a natural right for property. It's how you go about justifying such a right. So now, but just to evaluate the substance of what you said, right? You said maybe it's in our interests. Can you be more specifically what would be in our interest? So here's what I said, right?
I think that the confusion though is that people were assuming that you have a natural right to property, and therefore you would never want to violate a natural right to property, and that this therefore does violate that right.
What does?
This distributive type of justice or anything that we talked about now. But I don't think that that's as clear, because I think that like when on Monday your presentation was like 1, 2, 3, and if you just follow those, you don't have a natural right. But then when you bring in Locke and you bring in the argument for God, I think that you can make the argument for a natural right to property.
Yeah.
But I think that you then have to take some of the other Locke principles that were not found in those.
So the premises were probably just my attempt to distill Locke. So I don't think that, I think you might be making too much of the difference between Locke and me. But the more important thing is that I don't see the inference from X is a natural right to X can never be conditioned by any other factors. I don't think it's a valid inference. I don't think that Locke accepts it.
Well, there's a difference between a natural right and a legal right.
Yes, but it's not the case that anything that's a natural right is necessarily absolute.
But I think most people would argue that natural rights kind of are supreme to legal rights.
Yep, so would I. So, but nothing I said sort of.
I think that's why it is important to look at.
Okay, but what about this question, right? So let me sort of refocus your efforts, right? What do we need in order to make sure that when we make demands on others that they respect property rights, that demand is legitimate?
I guess a series of laws that are for preventing individual unjust actions like stealing.
Okay, good. So we should say we should have sort of ordinary laws against force, theft, fraud. Good. We need those. And I suspect empirically that would go a long way towards making it true that everybody has an interest, a stake in a private property regime. I don't know if it goes all the way, but it certainly goes a ton of the way.
Whatever the laws are, they should apply equally or to everyone.
Good. Sort of good. Let's say we have a principle of equality before the law. The law shouldn't show partiality. It shouldn't prioritize my interests above yours just because I'm better looking or whatever. Anything else?
I think those laws have to be partial and not as specific, but we also need like the social conventionalisms, where like as society, like in a society, we don't accept other one like coming into others' house, or although things are important because like for peer pressure,
Yeah.
we just don't do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably true, that you could have all the laws that you want in a society, they'd be really, really good ones, but if social conventions run counter to them, they won't matter so much. So you need to be, probably you need to have a certain, people with a certain type of disposition towards others. I think that's really important. I think that gets swept under the rug, or probably more likely assumed in most discussions of this issue. We just sort of assume that generally people are of normal goodwill. But if we happen to have a large enough segment of population that aren't of normal goodwill, you can have all the laws you want. It won't be very good. Yeah, there's a mic that should go here.
I was just thinking back to what you said about the proviso yesterday or Monday.
Yeah.
And there were two parts of it so we would need a way to determine what is enough left for the common good, or like enough, because that was the first part of the proviso.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
It turns out that in Locke's accounting, right, taking things out of the commons doesn't just leave enough. It leads to like a kind of a huge, robust production of more and more stuff, more than we've ever seen before, more than people 1,000 years ago could have even imagined. So that was part of, that's a requirement, but we've so surpassed that requirement that you're looking backwards down here at enough. We're up here. We have all this. Right.
and then the other part was about posterity
Yeah.
and ensuring that.
Yeah, and I'm sort of making use of that, right? And I asked this question: how much would it take? How much money would it take to get you to agree to go to the year 1800? Would any amount of money be enough to convince you to try it out? And I didn't have any takers. I don't have a time machine though, but I didn't have any takers on that offer. So yeah, things are much, much better than they ever were. I think it's attributable to the fact that we have a private property regime. But what else do we need? So think about people who are really poor. Think about the person who, if they respect private property rights, it might lead to their demise, or at least their serious injury. Do they have an interest in the system? What should we do about or for them? Anything? Say, suck it up. It's your fault. Your bad choices. Is that what you say? So one thing that you might want to do is look out for policies that actually interfere with people's ability to self-provision. There are still cities, municipalities that say no to Uber, that say no to Airbnb, that have said no to other sharing economy type arrangements of like cooking a gourmet meal in my house. There are licensing laws, occupational licensing laws that prevent people from doing things that they could do to actually make a good life for themselves. A lot of the time, the existing poverty that we see is a direct result of policies like those. One thing that you could do to improve social justice, to make society less unjust, is to eliminate those laws. These laws were deliberately implemented, not by a central distributor, but by policymakers who are probably responding to some argument or some interests that just neglect the interests of the poor. So one thing, and more that you could do, is get out of people's way. Right? One thing that you could do to make it legitimate that we demand other people comply with our institutions, our legal institutions, our rules about property, is give them the freedom to self-provision. Eliminate rules that protect big and powerful interests. Eliminate rules that insulate big and powerful interests from competition and erect barriers to entry into markets where people could provide for their own needs. Right? So I would say that would be a matter of social justice. Now there's one last thing, right? One last thing you could do. It could be, now this would be like an empirical thing that would need to be, we would need good social science to determine this. It could be that you could do all that. You could set up like just rules for a society rather than unjust ones. You could make sure that there weren't these artificial barriers that kept people from providing for their own needs. And I guess it could still be true that there are people left behind. Right? What about them? This was my starving in the streets question. This was my question about look, if I'm starving in the streets, how are my interests acknowledged by a social system that requires me to respect these property rights? Why shouldn't I take something from somebody if the only alternative to violating the social laws, the social rules, would be to die? Do I have any interest in such a social system if it requires that I die? I don't think so. That's why it's been part of virtually every classical liberal thinker to argue for some kind of basic provision, some basic minimum. Hayek argued for it. Uncle Milton Friedman argued for it. There's room within some interpretations of Nozick that he thought it was a fine idea. This isn't completely antithetical to the classical liberal tradition to have a sort of basic safety net for people who would otherwise be left behind. Why should we have that? Well, to give them an interest in the society, to make sure that they have a stake in continuing to respect the laws that we have that protect private property rights. If you don't have that, then what am I even doing here? Why should I care about your rules if they would allow me to die? Right? So you can take that that earlier distinction between law and legislation, and you could apply it to a kind of welfare state. When Hayek argues in favor of some kind of social minimum, the thing he's most careful about is to make sure that that we don't do that, right? That we don't want anything that's going to interfere with the efficient operation of the price system. Rather, you have like sort of general abstract, a kind of basic minimum. It could be like the negative income tax or something like that that Milton Friedman argued for, right? That would qualify as a welfare state of law, of general abstract rules, not the kind of grab bag mix of policies that we have in our society now that actually can be thought to do more harm than good. So that's a kind of welfare state, but it's not anything like what we have now. Thank you.